Well, howdy, everybody, and welcome to this conversation about the far-flung and growing efforts to hold the major carbon polluters accountable for their unique role in fueling the climate crisis. In case you've missed it, there's now a whole global effort underway to use the law and the courts to hold the oil, gas, and coal companies accountable for the climate emergency. From city, county, and state efforts here in the US to other lawsuits abroad and overseas, the fossil fuel industry, or what I like to call the carbon barons, are facing legal challenges like never before. Well, what are these lawsuits demanding? How exactly do they work? How are the carbon barons responding? And how does it all fit into the broader efforts to address the climate emergency? Well, here today in this panel for Bioneers, we've got an all-star panel to help break it all down for you. We've got Antonia Juhasz. She's an investigative reporter who's written about the fossil fuel industry for places like National Geographic and Harper's and Rolling Stone. We've also got here Michelle Jonker-Argueta, who's an attorney with Greenpeace International. And we've got Carroll Muffett, who's the executive director of the Center for International Environmental Law, who's actually coming to us from Glasgow, Scotland, where they're literally breaking down the sets and the stages from the COP26 climate meetings. My name's Jason Mark, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Sierra Magazine. Antonia, let's start with you. Maybe you could just give us the big picture. I think maybe starting with some of the climate suits in the US, but also explaining some of the big things that have happened internationally in the last year. Who is suing whom?
All right, first, got it. Figured out the technology. Thanks, Jason. So great to be with everyone, and thanks to Bioneers for having us. Of course, on my list of publications includes Sierra Magazine, so I'm thrilled to be with you for that, and hi to Michelle and Carol. So first to say, I'm joining you all from New Orleans, Louisiana, a place where there's a great deal going on climate litigation, but primarily our state suing the federal government over its actions. But the topic of our panel is all of this wave of litigation that's essentially shifted, or is in addition to what had been the focus of climate litigation for some time, which was individuals suing governments for their failure to take action on climate. And just in the last few years, really, there's been this push instead to, or in addition again, to have governments sue oil companies directly for their role in the climate crisis, and now also individuals suing oil companies for their role in the climate crisis. So there are many hundreds of litigation cases on climate change, but in the US, the case of cities and states suing oil companies directly is more like a couple dozen, around 26, I think is the number right now. And it started off on the coast, and most of these cases are the governments saying that the oil companies essentially owe damages for the costs that the governments have to incur for dealing with the mess that they're arguing the oil companies have created. So the costs of having to deal with the climate crisis being borne by cities and states. And like I said, started off with a lot of activity on the coast. And initially these were looking at the cost of dealing with sea level rise, but you've also got cases, for example, in Colorado, where Boulder County is suing Exxon and Suncor, I think it's Suncor, for things like increased pollution and increased wildfires. You've got in Washington State a suit that's looking at the impact on a reduction in salmon fisheries and the costs associated with that. And just as the increased harms of climate change have been felt by governments, you've seen the threats or impacts that they're saying that the oil companies need to reimburse them for. The list of items also increase. But a lot of these cases, and I'll let Carol and Michelle definitely talk specifics on all the legal sides of this. In the US, these cases have gotten pretty log jammed with successful efforts by the oil companies. But I think one of the really big cases to talk about, and I know we'll talk about a lot during this panel, and I'll just touch on here, was the huge shift in these cases, which happened in May with a district court in The Hague holding Shell liable for its contribution to climate change. So this was a class action lawsuit suing Shell for its role in the climate crisis and saying that its activities as an oil company, so not the damages that it's caused through its emissions, but its activities as an oil company through the exploration, production, refining, transport, and selling, and then the use of its product known to it, are causing emissions that are destroying our environment and harming basic human rights. And therefore, Shell is liable for this contribution and has to take action to reverse it. The court agreed. This was a huge victory that happened in May. And the court not only agreed with Shell's individual liability for its role in causing the climate crisis, but said that it had to take action. And as opposed to the cases that had been looking at damages, a financial remuneration, this was a case that demanded that Shell change its practices, change its operations so that it would not be harming our human rights and the environment. And those actions were that the court required that Shell cut its emissions by 45%, a huge cut, and in just 9 years' time. And there's lots of reasons why this case is important and precedent setting, which we'll get to more in the panel. But I think for listeners who are looking at the precedent for it, the case had so much in it in terms of the judgment of the judgment made by the court, laying out the specific contribution of the basic actions of Shell as an oil company that were causing the climate crisis, and saying that other oil companies, likely bear this responsibility as well, and therefore the potential to hold other oil companies accountable, or every other oil company accountable, using a lot of the foundations within this ruling are definitely there, particularly I think because the court said that the obligations under the Paris Climate Accord hold the government accountable to holding Shell accountable. Shell has said that it wants to adhere to the Paris Climate Agreement or holds it as important, and therefore Shell is also responsible to the Paris Climate Accord. And it opens it up that every company that's ever said that it cares about the Paris Climate Accord and every country that's ever signed on also has responsibility under this agreement. So really a landmark shift in this look at specifically holding oil companies directly accountable through litigation.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for that really great synopsis and overview of what's happening in the U.S. And then obviously the really huge ruling from Europe back in May, which I know you wrote about. I think for Rolling Stone, we covered it at Sierra, and that got a ton of news. But I'd love to hear, and Carroll, I'd love to hear from you because I know that this is really what you focus on. Maybe you could talk about some of the other cases that are moving in other venues that maybe haven't gotten as much attention as a major ruling out of The Hague or some of the U.S. cases. I'd love to hear from you, like what's happening in other venues and in other countries, and how is this really a global movement to hold the fossil fuel companies accountable?
I think that's a great and it's a critically important question, because what we're really seeing is litigation of this kind is accelerating in really incredible ways. From a Peruvian farmer who's suing a German coal plant operator and coal miner in German courts, and that case is actually moving to the merits, to the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, which undertook a landmark multi-year investigation into the impacts of climate change in the Philippines and the responsibilities of major oil and gas and coal producers for those human rights violations. And I think what we saw in that case was that commission, built a dossier of evidence, of testimonies, of expert witnesses that is really unparalleled in the world. And what we saw in the Shell case is now being echoed in cases being brought against Total in France and in jurisdictions around the world. And these cases are not just about what the companies did in the past. As Antonia alluded, increasingly these cases are looking at what we know about climate change right now, what the companies must know, and how their business models are aligning with those realities. And I'd love to talk about that more as we go along. But I think the really important thing to take away from what we're seeing is the litigation is accelerating, it is diversifying, it is happening in countries around the world. And it is increasingly including not only communities that have been harmed and individuals that have been harmed and states, but investors, pension fund beneficiaries, and others. I think what you see is the future of these companies, the future of Exxon, of Chevron, of Shell, of the carbon majors is a future that is going to be defined by ever accelerating litigation of this kind.
And I just want to point something out, Kyle. You say the future, but as Antonia was talking about, I mean, that Shell case was about their current business model. I mean, this is not about future damage. This is about ongoing damages of the way that they make money and make profit.
That's absolutely right. And I think what we're seeing is that the impacts of the climate crisis are accelerating all around us. And we have the Energy Information Agency, which has, puts the rosiest possible spin on the fossil fuel sector for decades. Even it is acknowledging that if we're going to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we have to stop expanding fossil fuel production right now, not next year, right now. You have the IPCC issuing a code red for the planet. You have human rights bodies around the world saying that that climate change leads to profound human rights violations and that fossil fuels are a part of that. And so in the midst of that, what we're seeing is increasingly people are looking at, the business models of these companies and saying, if you're building a business model that relies on fossil fuels far into the future, and if you cannot define how that business model is consistent with keeping the planet below 1.5 degrees of warming, then what you're really doing is investing in human rights violations on a very massive scale. And those human rights violations, not only sound in human rights, they sound in tort and other areas of law around the world.
So I'd love to bring Michelle into the conversation, Michelle Jonker-Argueta, who is an attorney with Greenpeace International and various Greenpeace independent offices and their national branches have been involved either as plaintiffs or as supporting actors in these lawsuits and in these legal challenges. So you've had like a front row seat for some of this, and I would love it if you could talk about, okay, so Carroll just said litigation is now like a daily part of these companies' existences, and it's their operations, right? They can't get away from it. They can't dodge it no matter what the venue is. So what's been the response that you all have seen from the oil majors and from the carbon barons? How have they responded to this legal offensive, I guess?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me over. And that's a very good question. I mean, as Carroll said, there's this huge increase in litigation. And so, of course, then you're going to see, the fossil fuel industry defending itself. And what we have seen is the responses from that litigation coming from the fossil fuel companies is just, the same that you see in different jurisdictions, a little bit of like the same broken narratives and the same false anti-climate defenses. And it's quite interesting to see how they're using the same arguments and with some success. Unfortunately, sometimes the courts actually buy into these falsehoods, and other times actually they don't. So like in the Shell case, for example, I can tell you a couple of examples of these broken narratives. What's important also to think about is that through strategic litigation, we can see how activists and affected communities are actually exposing the truth. And when the court sees it too and the public see it too, then there's also a significant breakthrough, and there could be positive change arising from litigation. To give you two examples, the first one is that, the perfect substitution argument or the market substitution assumption. And here the argument goes, look, if we don't have this fossil fuel project, somebody else is going to do it. So actually approving this project will not have a difference or a consequence in the environment. Oftentimes, this argument, we've seen it as a response to litigation. Oftentimes, it's unsubstantiated, basically saying that the global demand will be catered by another project elsewhere, so this project should go forward. And of course, this defense actually completely ignores the effect that the restriction on supply can have on price and in turn on demand. And in that way, a lot of fossil fuel majors have been able to continually and perpetually avoid accountability. And as you probably know, this is now the third report from the production gap report that has been produced, looking not at the emissions gap, but at the production gap. So this is the gap between what has to be produced to keep in line with the temperature targets, so the 1.5, for example. And looking at, by 2030, the latest report calculates there'll be something like 120% more fossil fuels being produced than is consistent with a 1.5 degree temperature target. So we've seen this perfect substitution argument being offered without any evidence and actually being accepted by some courts. For example, in the People versus Arctic Oil case in Norway, this was a case against a further expansion of production in the Norwegian Arctic. And there was a lot of evidence proffered showing that actually only half of the reduction in production volume would be replaced by production elsewhere. And there were a lot of other studies showing the lock-in effects of continuing production. And still, the state attorney, without proffering any evidence, actually had his arguments accepted by the Norwegian Supreme Court that there is a perfect substitution. So they should continue actually with a further expansion, since it would be produced somewhere else anyway. But fortunately for us, we've actually seen the rejection of this assumption in courts around the world, in the US, and also in Australia. And more recently, as Antonia was talking about in the Shell case, and was really, like Antonia said, there's a lot of really important language in that judgment. And one of the really exciting things that you see there is also the rejection of this assumption. Shell, one of the defenses by Shell was, look, it's going to be a one-to-one substitution. So any reduction that we do will be taken up by another fossil fuel company. And the court in The Hague was like, no, actually, this cannot necessarily be deduced. Even Shell actually tried to make this into an unfair competition claim, saying that any reduction by them that the court could order would be put them in an unfair competitive advantage and would disrupt the level playing field. But the court said, no, look, we have other companies that will have to also do their part and do a contribution to reducing emission. And the existence of other fossil fuel parties in the economy does not absolve Royal Dutch Shell from its individual partial responsibility to contribute to the fight against climate change according to its ability. So it's also looking at the ability. So I'm a little bit smiling because it's actually really nice language that we've also seen in Australia as well. And just to wrap up, like a second anti-climate defense I wanted to mention is that political question or justiciability issue, where you have the fossil fuel industry constantly trying to throw these cases out of court, saying, look, the judiciary is not the place to decide these questions. This is something for the legislature of the executive branches. And we actually see a lot of pretty much almost every single one of these claims is going to be, there will be an attempt to throw it out by saying that the court is not a place for it to be decided on or adjudicated. What I think it's good to pause here and acknowledge that there's a lot of corporate influence in the legislature. And in many places, of course, it's legal in the form of campaign contributions, and also in the revolving door that you see between corporate executives turned lawmakers or government employees and vice versa. So, for example, in the People versus Arctic Oil case, the courts did accept that they had a role in looking at government action, but the Supreme Court in the end thought that the threshold was actually really high and only would intervene if Parliament had grossly disregarded its duties with relation to the duty to take measures to protect the environment. But actually, in the Shell case in The Hague, what is really exciting is that the court rejected Shell's arguments that the judiciaries did not have a role, and actually said, look, this is a preeminently a task for the court to look at assessing these allegations and on the obligations for the Royal Dutch Shell has towards human rights and what its business model is doing in harming these human rights. So that's really exciting. And of course, it depends really on the legal system, how far this argument can go, because we have civil system, common law system, and it really depends. But I think we can expect more and more to see this defense. But at the same time, I think we can also expect more courts having to carve that space to hear and rule on these cases. Because, as you know, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and it's a social justice crisis. And it is the place to vindicate rights is the courts. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. It's really important. I mean, I don't want to give too much time, to offering the devil's advocate viewpoint, but it's really important for people to understand what the fossil fuel companies and the oil majors and the carbon barons are saying in order to rebut them. And I actually would love to hear from Carroll and Antonia in just a second, but do want to say that we've already got some questions trickling in. If you've got a question for any of the panelists, we'll get to those in a little bit. So if you've got a question, we've already got one in from Heidi in Maine, which we'll get to. Please drop them into the comments. So we heard Michelle talk about how in the Hague case, the judge ruled that Shell still had to take actions according to its ability. And I flashed on the word culpability. And I'm wondering, Carroll or Antonia, if either of you could address sort of the argument from the other side, why these arguments from the fossil fuel companies don't hold water, and why, at least as it's being argued by the plaintiffs, they have a unique culpability here, and that it's not just a case of, oh, well, we're providing the energy people want.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe if I could start with that second question first, because I think it's really important. We see the industry having pushed for many years this pervasive and pernicious myth that everybody is responsible for climate change. And if everybody is responsible for climate change, nobody is responsible. But what documentary evidence has made increasingly, profoundly clear in recent years is that this is an industry that understood the risks of climate change and understood the role of its products in those risks decades ago. From the 1950s, from the 1960s onwards, these companies were engaged in climate research. They were being warned by their scientists about the role of fossil fuels in contributing to climate change. And so, notwithstanding though that understanding of the risks, they undertook a decades-long campaign of denial, of obfuscation, of obstruction that continues even today. And so I think this is what we say when we talk about culpability. And I think it's really important because, at the end of the day, these companies' core product is oil and gas. Their core product is carbon. Oil and gas are predominantly carbon. And when you burn it, if everything goes perfectly, if everything goes exactly to plan, the result is that carbon dioxide is emitted. And so I think it's really important to recognize that the inevitable consequence of burning oil and gas is the release of the carbon dioxide that is the primary driver of climate change. And I think that, calling attention to that, exposing that, is one of the critical ways to push back against these industry narratives that they are not to blame for the climate crisis.
Thanks so much for that, Carlos. Super clear on that whole question of culpability. Antonia, I wonder if you've got anything to add to that in general, sort of the core argument from the plaintiffs in these various cases that sort of rebuts the oil companies and the fossil fuel companies' claims that they're not guilty.
What Shell has done in the wake of the ruling, for example, is start to sell off assets. So Shell sold basically all of its Permian holdings in the Permian section of Texas for $9.5 billion to ConocoPhillips. And it did this sale clearly to try and get rid of one of its most polluting set of assets, because the methane emissions from the Permian are so great that getting rid of those Permian operations really contributes to its attempt to try and make this really fast, rapid cut in its overall emissions. But now what Shell has been trying to do is essentially take credit for that decision. So just last month, Gretchen Watkins, the CEO of Shell, was joined by the heads of BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, the American Petroleum Institute, and the United States Chamber of Commerce. They were brought before Congress to address charges of stymieing action on climate, intentionally stymieing action on climate and stymieing legislative action on climate through intentional disinformation campaigns. And when Gretchen Watkins came before Congress, she said, look, we can show you evidence that we're trying to solve the climate crisis by the fact that we're pulling out of these polluting areas in fossil fuels. And she didn't say, one, that Shell is court ordered to make these changes, but also, I think more importantly, that Shell is appealing this ruling. So Shell is trying to take credit for the actions that it's undergoing as a result of the ruling, while it's simultaneously appealing the ruling. And what this hearing was getting at is also one of the pieces that a lot of the legislation is trying to address as well. The litigation is trying to address as well, which includes essentially consumer fraud claims and advertising fraud claims, which is getting at the greenwashing and the disinformation of the oil companies and including that within the litigation to say, just as Carroll was bringing up, that the companies knew that the burning of their products would cause climate destruction, that climate destruction would cause harm, and went ahead and continued with that activity, but then also publicly greenwashed its activities and publicly shared and disseminated disinformation to try to create uncertainty with the opposite idea. And that through those activities, they added greater costs onto governments to have to deal with the ramifications of a climate crisis, which could have been averted decades earlier if those disinformation campaigns and greenwashing was not taking place. And so those cases that are also going through the United States and also happening globally are also seeking to hold the companies to account for this behavior. In response, the companies continue have done a lot of things. So I think one of the things that was really telling at this congressional hearing was looking at the CEOs that were gathered, and the CEOs of each of the companies. The tenured, the longest serving CEO was Darren Woods at just 4 years at the head of his company. And that's really unusual for oil companies of the past. You would normally have executives who had been there for decades, who had held that position for decades. But these were all young CEOs or newly appointed CEOs. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is the ability to say what they continually said at the hearing, which was the claims of our oil companies in the past that were climate denialist. That wasn't me. That was somebody else. So our company isn't responsible for that. But two, to have a fresh face saying, look, we get it. We care about the climate crisis. We care about the Paris Climate Accord. We care about all of these activities. Well, one of the things that the committee put forward at the same time to try and address what the committee members were saying was an additional form of greenwashing was the lobbying reports of the oil companies. And the lobbying reports of each of the companies gathered in the American Petroleum Institute and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce essentially showed a very different record, which was attempts at lobbying on efforts to stymie climate action and not to try and advance legislation and agreements that would advance or would greater regulate their activities or advance tackling the climate crisis in a meaningful way. And of course, one of the reasons why the hearing took place in the first place was a sting operation with a ExxonMobil lobbyist basically admitting that the company was greenwashing its interest in carbon trading and carbon markets in an attempt to curry favor with the public, and then that led to this hearing. What we're also seeing, and I think maybe Carroll can address this even more clearly, or Michelle, is the companies continuing to talk a good game, but also really aggressively pushing back on these lawsuits in very aggressive and heavy-handed ways at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, trying very aggressively to squash them because they know that there's a huge, there's an existential threat being posed by these lawsuits. Because at the end of the day, particularly as we're seeing, as I said, with the Shell case, Shell says what you do as an oil company is fundamentally incongruous with our right to a healthy environment and our fundamental human rights. And therefore, you need to fundamentally change what you do as a company if you're going to be able to continue to operate. So that's an existential threat to continuing to be fossil fuel companies. And what the oil companies did repeat one after the other at this hearing was that they get it. They are transitioning. They're embracing the concepts of the climate crisis, the necessity of the climate crisis, and the necessity to address it. But they also each reiterated, we will be oil and gas companies now and in the future. You are going to need us to provide oil and gas now and in the future. So you are going to need to let us keep doing that. And that, completely conflicting set of statements that they're making is also runs completely against the findings of the judge in the Shell ruling, and that is why the oil companies are primarily saying good things publicly, but are fighting very, very aggressively to shut down all of these cases in every way that they can.
So I'm really glad you brought up, and Antonia, thank you for like a really great overview of those hearings, which were in late October in the House Oversight Committee here in the U.S. And that was framed a lot of both, I should say, the members of the committee, like Congresswoman Maloney and Congresswoman Ro Khanna, were trying to very explicitly say this is a big tobacco moment for big oil. And so, Carroll, as a litigator, as an attorney, I'd love to hear from you. I think most people understand or remember some of the history of the litigation, the historic litigation against the tobacco companies. I'm wondering, in what ways is the current predicament of big oil, in what ways is it similar to, and in what ways might it be different from the experience of big tobacco? Like, how does the analogy work, and in what ways is the analogy or the historical comparison not inaccurate?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And let me begin with one of the most important differences between the oil litigation that we're seeing and the litigation that we saw against big tobacco. And that difference is that the oil litigation that we're seeing learned from the tobacco litigation, and that is accelerating the timelines exponentially. It's really important to recognize that in the tobacco case, for the first 30 years of tobacco litigation, the story was always the same. The plaintiff always loses. And that continued to be the case until the plaintiffs themselves diversified. First it was individual smokers and their estates, and then it was people affected by secondhand smoke, whether children or others. And then, when things really started to change in the tobacco context was when states started suing the tobacco companies to recover the massive cost to the state of all of those healthcare, all of the lost economic activity. And that's what really transformed the tobacco litigation, but that took many decades. In the climate context, we've seen that happen in a matter of years, and we've seen that litigation really accelerating. And I think the other parallel that it's really important to recognize that in the tobacco context, it took similarly 3 decades before you had any court recognize that there was evidence of wrongdoing on the part of a tobacco company. In the climate cases, by contrast, there have been enormous exposés in recent years, which means that plaintiffs are coming into the courtroom with that evidence of corporate wrongdoing, with the company's own documents in their complaints, in their legal briefs, in the dossiers that they are giving to the judge right off the bat. And so that is a profoundly different scenario. I think, finally, I want to highlight one other really important parallel that we're seeing to the tobacco context. And that is the moment when things really transformed in the tobacco context was when the suits stopped being brought just against the tobacco companies And you started seeing the Tobacco Institute, their lobbying group, show up as a defendant. And that was really important because bringing in the Tobacco Institute demonstrated that it wasn't just one company, it wasn't just each company out there doing this for itself. The companies were working together in orchestrated, coordinated campaigns. And that's what gave rise to the federal racketeering uh, investigation into the oil industry that was really transformative and led to ultimately to a an enormous settlement. So that's really significant when you see that in the latest litigation that's being filed, that litigation is including not only the oil companies as a defendant, but the American Petroleum Institute. And we know from extensive documentary evidence that the American Petroleum Institute is led by the highest level executives of the oil industry, and that that the industry coordinated through API to run really sophisticated, long-lived, and very heavily funded campaigns of climate denial and obstruction. And so I think if you were looking for a watch this space in the analogies between oil and tobacco, that is it. I think we are seeing, on a really rapid trajectory, the emergence of evidence, not only that the companies individually misled the public, misled investors, misled, and obstructed regulation, but they did it in extensive coordination together. And that coordination has a name, and it's called racketeering.
It's a conspiracy, essentially. Carroll, thank you for that. That was, it's fascinating because I think people, toss out the tobacco parallel analogy all the time, but in many ways it's more complex and more interesting. In some ways, for those of us who are hungry for accountability, more encouraging than the sort of pat analogy makes it sound sometimes. I want to come back to something, Michelle, you were talking about earlier, because I think it's really important here. Antonia talked in depth about the importance of those House Oversight Committee hearings last month, and they were obviously really important, really historic. And yet you were making a case earlier that is important as, political action, the legislative action is, changing laws. It still is no substitute for what's happening in the courts. I think you were making the case, right, that because in lawmaking or in legislative venues, there's all sorts of corporate lobbying that happens. Or say at COP26, where if you were to add up all of the members of the fossil fuel delegation, they would have been the largest single nation state delegation that was there. So I'm wondering if you could kind of come back to that point and make it clear why, even when we have, say, legislative redress for the climate emergency, why that's no substitute for also demanding justice through the courts.
Thank you, Jason. I think, first of all, I should say that we really need all hands on deck in this moment of crisis. So we need people to be out there on the streets, exercising their rights to protest, to demand their government to do better, to demand corporate accountability. We need journalists and investigators exposing the truth and informing the public. We need scientists. We need the governments to negotiate real solutions to this crisis. The UN Framework Convention and the climate agreements, of course, set the state obligations to the legal standards, precautionary approach, best available science, intergenerational equity. All these things that are in the convention, the climate agreements, are necessary. But we also need the courts to keep these efforts from stalling, to interpret and help enforce these obligations. We need them to also keep the industry from misrepresenting its false solutions, and also to make sure that the efforts that governments are making are really reflecting truly their highest possible ambitions. So I can give you two reasons why the courts are necessary in this fight. And I think, first of all, what's really cool about litigation at this moment is that it's a way to close the gaps in accountability that we have. So I spoke earlier about the big gap in the supply and the production gap, and when it comes to Scope 3 emissions, so emissions in the value chain, it's really exciting both in the Shell case, as Antonia had mentioned, but also the People versus Arctic Oil case. The Scope 3 emissions are now more taken as something that should be taken into account. And it is
just really quickly, Michelle, just for the lay audience, the Scope 3 emissions are?
So for example, so you have scope 1, which is the emission that is directly by the company, right? So the company goes and does emits. So that's the scope 1. Scope 2 is, for example, if they get like a product, the energy that was used to create a product, that would be scope 2. Scope 3 is the end user. So scope 3, for example, and I will tell you right now, in the People versus Arctic Oil case, this is 95% of the emissions from Norwegian oil are actually emitted outside of Norway. So this is the combustion of the fossil fuel outside of Norway. So that will be a scope 3. And in the Shell case is also the combustion of its product by the end user. So that's what I mean when it comes to scope 3. So in Norway, it was 95% of emissions that were not taken into account until this judgment in the People versus Arctic Oil case. And in the Shell case, it was something like 86% of emissions that were not taken into account until now. In the Shell case, it says, hey, you have to also take into account these emissions as well. So in the Shell case, for example, the court saw that, look, business enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights. This includes the responsibility to seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to its operations. So this is also down the value chain, so scope 3, which includes the end users. And this responsibility, actually, because the Royal Dutch Shell actually sets the energy package, it sets the energy policy for the group. So it can actually, just like it offers its product, it can choose not to offer its product. So the court said in The Hague said that this judgment could mean that Royal Dutch Shell actually forgoes new investments in the extraction of fossil fuels, or will have to limit its production of fossil fuels. So this is actually quite significant. In the Norwegian case, it was also significant that now the emissions from combustion of Norwegian oil outside of Norway, so 95% of these emissions, should be taken into account as well. So that's really exciting. The problem with the Norwegian judgment is that the court really saw the severity of the climate crisis, but totally missed the mark on the urgency. As the court said, look, we have to take into account these emissions. These emissions are the responsibility of the Norwegian state, but we can do that at the production state, so later on. And the second thing that I would say that is very important, why we're using the courts at this point, is because, as I mentioned before, climate change is a human rights issue and it's a social justice issue. And in order to protect the most vulnerable communities and help them assert their rights and take back their power, we have to go through the courts. So I think that's why it's not the only way to go. It's not the only venue, but it's one of the battlegrounds where we're going to have to fight as well to deal with this crisis.
Justice will require a judgment and redress in the courts. And the scope 3 emissions is so important, right? Because it's like essentially saying, listen, you've sold a combustible, flammable material. You are responsible for selling that combustible, flammable material, and essentially, being a party to arson. That's obviously my words, not the attorneys. We got a number of questions here. We've got about half an hour left. I'm thinking, how about we go to some of these great questions from all of you who are listening? And again, thanks to all the Bioneers participants and the audience for tuning in and being a part of this conversation. So we're going to hit some of these questions, and then I'm hoping toward the end of the conversation, we can come back to each of the panelists and ask them to look a little bit into their crystal ball for things that are kind of on the middle horizon. We've got a question here, and this might be on some folks' mind, and I don't know who wants to tackle this. But it's about the case of Stephen Donziger, who some folks might remember is an attorney who led a multi-year effort to hold Texaco and then Chevron Texaco responsible for a massive oil spill in the Amazon. And eventually, through the course of that litigation, then became a defendant himself and was recently sentenced to prison. I think has begun serving a prison time on kind of a countersuit that Chevron filed. I'm wondering if anybody feels equipped to offer an update on the Donziger question. And also, I think what this questioner is getting at is when you see those really kind of hardball tactics from the oil and gas companies, in this case Chevron, doesn't that have a chilling effect? Will that have a chilling effect on other attorneys who are perhaps considering litigation against these hugely powerful and hugely wealthy companies? So anybody want to tackle perhaps the consequences of the Donziger case?
Let me start with its intent, because its intent is exactly what you said. Its intent is to chill and to intimidate anyone who would seek to hold these companies accountable. I won't get into the details of Stephen Donziger's case. He has been, held on contempt. I will say that human rights authorities, legal organizations, including our own, and legal organizations around the world have looked at that case and called it a profound judicial overreach and miscarriage of justice. The idea of an attorney being persecuted to such a profound degree on what is what should be a routine contempt charge, particularly when you see that the judge who brought these charges actually had Donziger investigated by a team that had previously represented Chevron itself. It is nothing less than extraordinary. But I want to back up from the Donziger case and say again, while it is an intense example of how this industry operates, it's not an isolated one. On the morning after Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, I received a subpoena, hand signed, hand dated, from ExxonMobil, and I was not alone. Exxon sought to leverage the change in the political environment to bring a massive intimidation campaign against a number of organizations, researchers, philanthropies that were involved in holding the company accountable. And we see that those efforts being lodged not only against nonprofits, not only against journalists and foundations, but against plaintiffs in the cases, against their attorneys, including including attorney Matt Pawa, who's representing some of the cities that have sought to hold Exxon accountable. Exxon turned around and subpoenaed individual city officials in those cases. So absolutely, we see this industry working to intimidate, to suppress, and to silence anyone who would try to expose what the industry is doing and hold them accountable. And all I can say is, notwithstanding the intensity of those efforts, we are not being silenced, and the efforts to hold them accountable are not stopping.
And Carol, not to get too much in your business, but those subpoenas of you and Powell, those were in the cases connected to the Oakland and San Francisco suits, correct? Some of the earliest city and county level lawsuits against the oil companies.
That's correct for Matt Pawa. Both Matt Pawa and I, along with many others, were subpoenaed by Exxon in an effort to derail the investigations by New York and Massachusetts into Exxon's operations.
Well, I'm sorry that happened to you, though it is a really powerful example of the lengths to which these companies will go to protect their interests, which, of course, are their financial interests. So we've got a number of great questions here. Thank you all for being such an engaged audience. We have a question here for Luke, and maybe this might be a good one for you, Michelle. Luke is wondering if anybody is trying to quantify the lives lost due to the climate crisis and due to then fundamentally, or so the claims allege, the actions of the fossil fuel companies. So has anybody tried to calculate how many lives have been lost due to climate consequences?
Yeah, thank you, Luke, for your question. That I'm aware of, I do not know of anyone at this moment trying to quantify the lives lost due to the climate crisis. I do know that there are many cases where you do actually have a number. And the case, for example, in the Philippines, that was one of the reactions to the super typhoon Haiyan that hit the Philippines in 2013, where there were about 7,000 deaths and about 4 million people displaced. In the weeks following that storm, there were many questions asked, like, is climate change exacerbating these weather events? And through the science and attribution science, this Filipino people and civil society in the Philippines were able to actually file a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. And Carol already mentioned a bit about this case, but it is based on that, coming from that particular super typhoon that led to 7,000 deaths. I think it's an important effort to keep track, I think, there was a very recent celebration of life of the survivors and the memory of those lost in the Super Typhoon Haiyan. And I can tell you one life lost is one too many, to be honest. So I don't know the exact number, but if you hear the stories of the survivors and the stories of them remembering their family members and those lost, you also get that fire in your belly when you're like really, I think as Jason said, hungry for accountability and hungry for justice. So I do think that the science is getting better, attribution science is getting stronger. So you will see more, I think, of these numbers and more of these stories as people go to the courts to try to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for these extreme weather events.
And thank you so much for that, Michelle. I think Michelle makes a really important point to Luke's question, which is any death is one death too many. And unfortunately, as we know, the toll from things like Typhoon Haiyan, the Paradise Fire, those are unfortunately at this point in time only likely to increase. I just want to break down one thing you said, Michelle, if you could explain attribution science, right? Attribution science is the increasing ability of climatologists and others to sort of look at changes to the global atmosphere and the global climate and say, oh, something like a typhoon or a hurricane or say a massive heat wave in the Pacific Northwest could not have happened or likely would not have happened without climate change. We've got a question, maybe this is for you, Antonia, though I think Michelle, maybe you could chime in on this as well. Bob wants to know if there's been any signs from big oil to use bankruptcy in bankruptcy law as a way of shielding themselves. And Bob makes a really good point. There's some folks have maybe heard about this, the way that Johnson & Johnson in the case over the baby powder sort of spun off some sort of side corporation in order to take on the liabilities of that multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. So Antonia or Michelle, do you guys want to talk about anything that maybe big oil might be doing to try to, you know, move around their assets and to shield themselves from liability?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So first, just real quickly on the Donziger case in Chevron, I think it's just important to remind ourselves that the attacks against Donziger began after he won I think it's $9.5 billion, if I've got it right, a $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron in Ecuador for the pollution caused by Texaco. So this has been an effort to respond to that court victory, which Chevron bought Texaco, which Chevron has refused to pay, and now they are attacking the lawyer who brought the case. So that is in response to a case itself. And also on the Shell case, and this is all going to get me up to bankruptcy in a second, because it's all about the potential losses to these companies. I forgot to mention that while Gretchen Watkins, the CEO of Shell, was talking about essentially demonstrating that Shell is selling off its fossil fuel pieces, and that's an example of it becoming a diversified energy company and an example of the company getting that it needs to shift to renewable energy. The money from the sale of its Permian assets didn't go to renewable energy. So Shell reported that it sold those assets in the Permian and it used the proceeds to return the money to shareholders, and 7 billion of the 9.5 billion is returned to shareholders, and the rest will be used to shore up its balance sheet, is what Shell reported. So not to invest in renewable energy, but rather in buybacks and dividends, and to address shortfalls in its budget. So that's where the money is actually going. So oil companies are interesting, and they're different than Johnson & Johnson. So of course, right now we're seeing a wave of bankruptcies among smaller companies. In the United States in particular, you've got fracking companies that have been going belly up left and right and at historic numbers, because essentially and these are smaller companies, you're seeing much less willingness of private investors and banks to shore up the losses of these companies. U.S. fracking companies have never been profitable, but they've been backed up by, like I said, private finance and banks. And now, because of public pressure, because of financial losses, because of more money to be made in other sectors, you're just seeing much less willingness to accept those losses and to have those bankruptcies continue. To have those losses continue, and the companies are declaring bankruptcy and they're folding. But the larger oil companies, the majors, the super majors, are many, 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 many times larger than Johnson & Johnson. They're still among the largest companies on the planet. And so I think in dealing with the losses that they are potentially going to incur from litigation and from things like loss and damage being considered at the COP, and Carroll can talk about that. It's a whole nother potential piece of litigation at governments and at oil companies. They're also facing, of course, the potential of massive stranded assets. So trillions of dollars worth of oil and gas that they hold. And right now, you still see the oil companies trying to do everything they can to increase their holdings of oil and gas. So ExxonMobil has this massive investment, this massive find in Guyana, which keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger in offshore Guyana. And as I reported for The Guardian, not too far in the future, it expects that its production from Guyana is going to be even bigger than its production in the U.S. Permian, which is its current largest source of production. But they keep wanting to add on to these holdings because still their worth as a company is still based on how much oil and gas they hold. And they keep buying up more assets and keep trying to demonstrate that they can produce those assets because that's still how their value as a company is measured. But if we decide as a society, as a world, that we want to keep those assets in the ground, as the International Energy Agency has told us has to happen, no new investments in fossil fuels can be possible, the IEA found, to reach our commitments under the Paris Climate Accord, then those assets become an enormous, enormous financial burden. And I think if you combine the potential risk now through this litigation, really is demonstrated by Shell, that could have this huge effect across litigation across the world, that potential of litigation through loss and damage at the COP, and stranded assets. You've got these major oil companies, including state-owned oil companies, that are definitely facing not just bankruptcy, but bringing governments and state and citizens with them, with the potential for losses. And what I think you're going to see is the industry maybe try and do things like Johnson & Johnson. There's been some talk about Shell potentially breaking itself up into smaller pieces to try and sort of protect out different pieces. But I think what's most likely is that the companies are going to continue to try to have, whether they are public or private companies, whether they are state-owned or not, governments bear the burden for their potential losses in the form of indemnity, in the form of subsidies, in the form of government protection. And that's one of the things that the public needs to look at really, I think, intently right now, is the extent to which oil companies are going to try to secure their fate by putting burden on individuals through our governments.
On citizens, putting the burden on citizens and on national governments.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for that super thorough rundown of the finances and sort of the books of the oil and gas companies and how it all works. Michelle, do you have anything you want to add on that about whether and how Shell or any other oil majors might try to kind of hide the ball in this case, meaning their ginormous fortunes in the course of this litigation?
No, a small addition, and I think it actually goes to the last thing that Antonia was saying about governments basically bailing out companies. And I think it's important to pause and look at the last, almost 2 years of the pandemic, and look at what the COVID-19 relief that governments had given to the fossil fuel industry. I think it's very important to see really that with tax breaks or other types of subsidies, governments are really willing to keep this industry alive. And so we have to also consider in the litigation government targets to make sure that they live up to their obligations in the Paris Agreement. We saw a very recent victory in Mexico. One of the plaintiffs was also Greenpeace Mexico, and they were claiming that the COVID-19 relief was not up to par with the Paris Agreement, because there was a lot of money being given to the industry, and actually the courts upheld those claims. So it's something to also keep in mind that, yes, it is corporate accountability and corporate litigation is on the rise, but we have to remember that we can always run to the government and ask for some help. And we've seen that a lot in the last almost 2 years of the pandemic.
Which brings us back to the question, and Antonia mentioned it briefly, talking about loss and damage in the UN talks. And I want to come back to a question we have from Heidi in Maine, and maybe this is for you, Carroll, since you've been in Glasgow for the past couple of weeks, which is, what kind of talk or discussions have there been within COP26, either the official negotiations or the different conversations on the side among and within civil society about accountability there? Are there any mechanisms within the UN FCC for perhaps accountability of these fossil fuel corporations?
Thanks. And there are two really distinct but related answers to that question. If you look at what's going on in the formal negotiations of the COP, the answer is clear. And you can guess that answer if you follow the news and you know that the largest single delegation that anybody has here is the more than 500 delegates that the fossil fuel industry has scattered across multiple countries. And so the single largest delegation in the entire climate negotiations is the fossil fuel industry's delegation. And maybe it's not surprising then that 30 years on from the beginning of the climate negotiations, one of the big fights we're facing in the final hours of this COP is whether we can even get the Conference of the Parties, get this convention to say the words fossil fuels. In other words, can we get the climate convention to acknowledge that fossil fuels drive climate change? And the answer for a very long time has been no. And so if you're looking for action inside the documents, the short answer is we're not seeing that movement. But if you look in the negotiations, if you look in the halls here, if you look in the streets surrounding the halls, the answer is yes, those calls for accountability are rising and they are accelerating. There are now, when this work really began in its early stages, a little more than a decade ago, there were very few people involved in it, very few people talking about it. Now there are entire days dedicated, and entire conferences dedicated to the acceleration of climate litigation. And much of it is talking about how to hold these companies accountable. So are people talking about corporate accountability? They absolutely are. It's just that they're no longer being constrained by what's going on in these negotiations to seek that accountability. And this is one of the reasons we see the rise of litigation, in courtrooms around the world.
Well, folks, thanks for that, Carroll. And it's encouraging to hear that finally there's some conversation on the other, at least within civil society, about how to accelerate the demand for accountability and how to accelerate the litigation. It's kind of wild, but time flies when you're talking about corporate accountability. We've only got about 10 minutes left. I want to thank, again, all the panelists, Carroll and Michelle and Antonia, for all of your insight and your wisdom and the information you've shared today. And I want to thank all the panelists for tuning in and listening to this conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. There's some great ones in there. Just means we need to continue this conversation as we continue this move for accountability. I thought we could close in just the last 10 minutes by offering each of our great panelists, and maybe we'll go, just because I'm looking on my screen this way, we'll go Antonia, Michelle, and then Carroll, to just give a couple 2 to 3 minutes of what you see on the middle horizon, or even say in the short term, like kind of what's next, and whether that's stuff in Congress like the House Oversight Committee, whether that's international lawsuits or litigation here in the United States. What do you think are the things that our audience should be keeping an eye on, say, in the next year or so? So if everybody could take 2 or 3 minutes, that'd be a great way to wrap up. What's on the horizon? Antonia.
Well, I think, when I was reporting the piece you mentioned for Rolling Stone on the Shell ruling, what I heard over and over again from lawyers and activists was the Shell case is really the beginning of a turning point, and that oil companies everywhere should expect lawsuits following the Shell model, that showing that the fundamental aspects of the fossil fuel industry, and again, as Michelle laid out, scope 1, 2, and 3, exploration and production, refining and transportation, the use of their products by end users, that each piece of that chain runs contrary to our rights to a healthy and safe environment and fundamental human rights, and that we are to expect litigation not only in countries that recognize the fundamental right to human rights, but also within, for example, the United States, within the litigation that's already taking place, to bring this argument into these cases, including the ones that are looking at greenwashing and disinformation, that this is more sort of proof to show the industry is well aware and has been well aware of the impacts of its products. It misled the public in how to use those products, and the public would have made different choices had it had better information, and we would not have suffered as many consequences as we have so far, and we will be able to avert more problems in the future if the companies are forced to change their behavior. That's going to be sort of the whole dialogue, and I think we can expect many more cases internationally and domestically in the United States as a result. And I think also based on these new studies, including the International Energy Agency report, is also finding that there can be no new investments in fossil fuels to avert the worst of the climate crisis, and the necessity of 1.5 degrees Celsius as a limitation for warming, which was set out as a goal in the Paris Climate Accord, is now very clearly locked into Copenhagen. And I think that's going to add further fuel, again, to litigation, which is going to say oil companies can't continue to behave the way they have been operating within the commitments that the United States and every other country that's a party to the Copenhagen Accord is now making. And that's going to add to more litigation. I think also just this role of human rights, Carroll can talk a lot more about this. I've learned a lot about this from him in my reporting, that the role of human rights within litigation is going to play an increasing role as it becomes more grounded in law, that the impacts of the climate crisis run contrary to our guaranteed fundamental human rights. I'd also just say,
and then we should offer to another panelist in a second.
I'm sorry. Okay, well, one sentence really quickly, then I'm sorry. What the oil industry is arguing right now really aggressively is that the world is going to be in crisis because you're not letting us produce enough oil and gas. That the energy shortage that we're facing right now is going to be intensified because you are making the price of oil and gas too expensive and you are not letting us produce enough. And that argument is going to become louder and louder and louder. And that the answer to that argument is borne out in every single study that we have, that's increasingly coming forward now, which is that the problem is that we're not investing fast enough in renewable energy. We're not investing fast enough in efficiency. We're not investing fast enough in changing consumption so that we can leapfrog much more rapidly over oil and gas. And we're going to see those arguments play out in litigation as well. And thank you all very much.
So, Michelle, any thing you want to build off of what we just heard from Antonia? She says more lawsuits, probably more lawsuits that are making the arguments around consumer fraud. And in addition to that, more lawsuits that are trying to hold the companies to the word that their national delegations have made, the promises they've made through the UN processes. Michelle, what do you see coming up?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, and if this is not good news, we will see more extreme weather events. So let's start with that. There will be more loss of life. There will be more loss of biodiversity. And we already see, as you know, that at 1.1 increase in temperature, already the climate impacts are falling disproportionately on populations which are disadvantaged and disenfranchised. So because of that, I think we will also see more lawsuits coming from affected communities asserting their rights and trying to take back their power through the courts. So that's something that I think we will see also in the future. We will also see more victories, I think, where you can have the big splashy victories like in the German constitutional case and the recent case in France. and other cases that we've been talking about today as well. But you'll also see wins that are very incremental and that will have to build on each other with time that we probably do not have. So that's the other side of the coin. And I think Antonia pretty much gave a full overview of the picture of what's to come. You are going to see more of the anti-climate defenses and the broken narratives that I discussed a little bit. Like you saw, like that we were discussing the Dossinger case, I think that's of course a very visible case, but there is still a very big attack on holding these corporate actors accountable in the indigenous communities and communities of color and others that are less visible, that are out there in the world. And I think you're going to see more of that. It's a bit invisible. I think it's not covered enough by the media, but environmental defenders are under attack. So I think you will see that as well. And yes, absolutely, more lawsuits filed at domestic level, but as you saw, there will be also lawsuits at the international level as well. There's a couple of suits, 3 actually, 4 even, at the European Court of Human Rights on climate. So I think those are things that we can definitely expect. Antonia said it quite right. The fossil fuel industry will get louder, but we need to be even louder and everywhere, outside the courtroom, inside the courtroom, in the media, in our conversations, also at home with everybody. I think that it's a really all hands on deck moment, and I do think that we're going to pull through, but I think it's going to be a close one, to be honest, and we have very little time.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I think that's both, encouraging and also a realistic take on where we're at. And I think the question of time is so important, right? Because unfortunately, the wheels of justice sometimes move slowly, but reckless endangerment moves very quickly, as we're seeing, and is accelerating. Carroll, to you, is there anything you want to add from what you've heard from Antonia and Michelle? Things that people should be on the lookout for in the middle horizon in the next year or so, next couple of years?
Yes, and I'll be really brief because I know we're running out of time. I think here's what you can expect to see. We've already talked about this transition from litigation focused on the past to holding companies accountable for their future business plans. Realize that it's not only the oil and gas companies that are likely to be held accountable. You're increasingly likely to see litigation focusing on the complicity of financial actors in both the investments the company's making and the human rights impacts of those investments everywhere. So I think that's one of the next phases of this litigation we're likely to see, is it extends beyond the oil and gas companies themselves to the financial actors who provide the biggest pipeline of all to keep that industry moving. I think we'll also see an evolution in the litigation to begin focusing on the ongoing denial that these companies are engaged in. That's looking at greenwashing, that's looking at false solutions. I think that is going to be another step in the litigation as well. And I think, just to echo what Michelle said, you're going to start to see victories, and critically, that means you're going to start seeing more and more cases, even in the U.S., start to move to the merits, despite the company's best efforts to keep them from reaching that. And that means more documents will come to light, more evidence will come to light, more executives will be required to testify, and information breeds information. And so more and more truth is going to be coming to light.
So follow the money. The attorneys and the plaintiffs, and as Michelle was saying, the impact of the affected communities are going to start following the money up the chain of accountability. And hopefully, again, the impacted communities will see their day in court, because as Carroll was saying, so far in the U.S., we've not seen a case on its merits. But I think we're going now into year 5 of just procedural efforts, successful efforts so far by the oil and gas companies to forestall this accountability. Well, thanks again to Antonia Juhasz, investigative reporter. Check out her work, Antonia Juhasz. Google her and all of her great work. Carroll Muffett from the Center for International Environmental Law. I think it's CIEL.org. I hope I got that right. Check her out. And I'm sure you all know where to find Greenpeace International and the very many fantastic work of Greenpeace national groups all around the world. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and being part of this conversation. And I'm sure with the Bioneers audience, all of the good works that you are involved in to foster this kind of accountability. Thanks for the conversation, y'all.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Michelle.
Well,
Thanks so much.
Safe, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much.